Hey, I'm Stephan Papadakis. We're here at our shop in Carson, California, where we're building this new 2020 Supra into our competition drift car. We've already disassembled the car and have completed a lot of heavy fabrication. I'll link to those in the description down below. But for now, we're going to show you guys how we painted it and we'll start the final assembly. Let's get started. Now that we're done with all the fabrication for the roll cage, and we've built most of the components that are going to get bolted onto the car, we're going to take the chassis to get coated. We're also going to get all of the aluminum parts anodized and the steel parts powder coated. Last time we brought the trailer into the shop, but this time we have a car in the lift, so we couldn't actually get the flatbed inside the shop. So we decided to forklift the car out onto the flatbed. We transported it down to the powder coating shop. We went to Primo Powder Coating down in Huntington Beach to get not only the parts powder coated, but the chassis as well. A lot of people will paint chassis, but we've powder coated our last several race cars with great results. They start off by adding a ground strap to the chassis because the powder itself is positively charged coming out of the gun. It's attracted to the negative side, which is now the chassis. The powder then sticks and coats the entire chassis and is ready to go into the oven. They have a giant oven that's large enough to fit the whole car in, and they heat it all the way up to 400 degrees for 45 minutes. The powder coat is actually closer to plastic than it is paint because it's polymer based. And what happens is essentially that powder melts. When the heat activates it, it forms long chain molecules that makes it all stick together and coats the entire surface. It makes it a lot more chip resistant than paint. When you see the smoke coming off the chassis as it exits the oven, that's actually the seam sealer and a lot of the stuff inside the chassis smoking out. It's not the powder coat. Powder coat is arguably more eco-friendly than painting because it doesn't include any solvents and it has no VOCs. Now, less than 24 hours after leaving the shop, the car's back, all coated and ready for assembly. So while the chassis and all the steel parts were getting powder coated, we sent out all of our aluminum parts to be anodized. The anodized process is a bit different than powder coat, but we'll cover that in a different video. So we'll start off by putting the front subframe in and then the front suspension. The front suspension is actually relatively simple. There's a lower control arm, there's a strut, and a front hub. We have a large selection of different spring rates that we can use to tune the chassis and also different damper settings for the shocks. It's also very adjustable, unlike a factory suspension, because depending on the track and depending on what the driver wants for the feel of the car, we'll make adjustments to roll center heights, front steering Ackerman, and other suspension geometry to change the handling of the car. With the front suspension installed, we move to the back of the car to do work on the fuel cell. The fuel cell consists of a few components. We've got the red aluminum shell, that's just a box that the main bladder sits in. The fuel cell bladder is designed in a way that if it takes a hit or if there's a big impact, it won't rupture. The nitrous bottle is mounted with a quick release, so in the heat of competition, when we need to change the bottle as it gets low, we don't need any special tools. We move the radiator to the rear of the car for a couple of reasons. One is if the car gets into an impact, it's more protected. Number two is we want a little bit more weight over the rear tires instead of the front, and that can help with traction. And it separates the intercooler in the front of the car from the radiator. When you stack those two together in the front, it makes it hard for both of them to cool. When we separate them, they can have their own unique airflow and help the cooling of both. Believe it or not, my favorite electric fan to use on these radiators is off of a 90s Lincoln Mark 8. You can get them for really cheap on eBay, and they flow a huge amount of air. So once the components were installed, it's time to plumb the system, get the fluid from one part to the other. And we do that with tailor-made custom XRP hoses. We get lengths of bulk hose and all of the fittings, and then we measure and cut all of the hose to length. We then bring the cut hose and the fittings down to XRP. The way these hose assemblies are designed is that the hose goes on these fittings with this collar. The collar is then swedged in this special machine, which basically crimps it down and acts like a hose clamp to keep the whole thing permanently assembled. Depending on the hose size, there's different crimping dies that they put into the swedging machine. If you look on the left, that's before the crimp, and on the right, you can see where everything has been smashed down together in the die. Once the hose is assembled, it gets pressure tested. The way they pressure test it is they fill the line with water and then bring the pressure up to 800 psi. They actually have a capability of 2000 psi depending on the application. Now that the lines are ensured that there's no leaks and it's been assembled properly, it's off to the engraver where they put a serial number on each one. That serial number corresponds to a drawing of each line so they can reproduce it without actually seeing the line. So if we call them up and want another line, we just give them the serial number and they can duplicate it without copying the original line. And it also has our name on it. Once all of our tailor-made lines were back at the shop, we started doing the assembly. We found that running the soft coolant lines from the front of the rear of the car has been the most reliable for us. The other lines that go from front to rear are the fuel lines. So we've got two lines, the feed line that goes through a fuel filter, up to the fuel rail, out of the fuel rail into the fuel regulator, and then all the way back to the fuel cell again through the return line. Now with the radiator installed in the rear of the car, we have a lot more room for the intercooler at the front. There's a specific size intercooler I wanted to run, but they actually don't make it off the shelf. So what we decided to do was take two intercoolers, cut one of them down to make the size that we wanted. The intercoolers then get welded together and custom end tags fabricated. When designing the intercooler system, there's a few things that we have to take into consideration. The best cooling we can get for the charge air, but also make sure that the car is easy to work on. So we angle the top of the intercooler a little bit farther forward, and that gives us room for an intercooler fan, an air intake pipe, and also access to the front of the engine if we ever need to work on it without having to pull the intercooler off. After the installation of the pedals, we then made all of the brake lines. The brake lines are made from 3/16 stainless steel tubing. They come in huge 20-foot lengths that we then cut down and bend to meet the profile that we need to fit the car. Once the line is flared to match the angle of the fitting, the nut secures it in place. With the brake lines all done, I moved on to mounting the hats to our brake rotors. The rotors are mounted to the rotor hats with a special fastening system. After everything is torqued to spec, we apply a thread locker that's a wicking style. It's applied after the bolt has been torqued, and it seeps into all of the threads. Little pro tip here, I like to add a mark on the first bolt that I've torqued to ensure that I've tightened every one. Before installing the rear end, we filled it with Lucas gear oil. We use an 85/140 weight. You fill the rear end like most rear ends, where you install the oil through a fill plug. So when it sits level, the fluid comes up to the bottom of the hole. The drive shaft is what links the transmission to the rear end. It's made out of carbon fiber. It slips into the rear of the transmission and then bolted to the rear end. The transmission we're using is a G-Force GSR transmission. It's a 4-speed dog box with straight cut gears and is often used in NASCAR. If you're interested in learning more about this transmission, I'll link to a video that I did where I disassemble and discuss how the whole thing works in the description down below. We're using a 4-disc tilt-in clutch to a custom flywheel that we had built specifically for our B58 engine. The seats we're using are a Halo type seat from OMP. It's a racing seat that has these side supports for the driver's helmet that make it safer in an impact. Our new fabricated center console not only houses the keypad, but also the brake bias knob and helps to mount the dashboard. It uses Zeus fasteners to install, which are just quarter-turn fasteners, which makes it easy to remove if necessary. We've trimmed away most of the dash, but we've kept the top skin to keep that Supra style. We round off the interior with our OMP steering wheel, a quick release hub, and this sweet yellow shift knob from JSP Fab. I wanted to try something new on this build, which is more 3D printed parts. Normally we would fabricate the headlight mounts and other brackets out of aluminum or metal. This one I decided to design and then 3D print the bracket. That way in the future, if we need to replace any of these, we can just print it and we don't have to do all the fabrication again. It really feels like the car's getting close when we install the windshield and the rear quarter glass. The rear hatch will eventually be replaced with Lexan. All right, guys, so thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button. In upcoming videos, we're going to do the first start of the car. We're going to take the car to the chassis dyno, then to the track for the first time. So if you want to see those, please consider subscribing, and you'll get notified when we have those videos released. Thanks for watching. I think they cut the flange off. On accident, probably. Or is that supposed to be there?